Medieval kings spent fortunes hunting down forest outlaws. They failed for decades, not because outlaws were better fighters, but because they discovered a diet so sustainable that nobles actually banned peasants from knowing about it. The craziest part? You've probably walked past this food source 100 times. Here's the thing most people don't realize about medieval forests. They weren't wilderness. They were property, royal property. And stepping into one without permission was like breaking into the king's personal refrigerator. Except the punishment wasn't a fine. It was death, or blinding, or castration, depending on the king's mood and what century you happened to be born in. By 1200, roughly 30% of England was designated royal forest. That's nearly a third of the country where ordinary people couldn't hunt, fish, or even pick up a fallen branch for firewood. Seriously, one stick could cost you a hand. So here's the brutal irony outlaws faced every single day. They're hiding in a forest absolutely overflowing with food. Deer everywhere. Boar rooting through the underbrush. Rabbits practically tripping over each other. And touching any of it meant the gallows. Makes sense, right? The crown wanted those animals for noble hunting parties. Peasants got turnips. Lords got venison. That was the deal. But outlaws had no turnips. No farms, no villages willing to openly feed them. Every meal became a calculated crime. Starvation on one side, the death penalty on the other. And somehow, they had to thread that needle day after day, week after week, sometimes for years. This is what forced them to become something unexpected. Not just criminals, not just desperate men. They became experts, risk calculators. They learned exactly which foods were worth dying for and which ones nobody cared about. They developed night hunting techniques to avoid foresters. They ate cold meat rather than risk cooking smoke. They turned survival into a science. And the first thing they mastered? The one protein source that could sustain an entire band for a week. Deer. A single red deer could feed a band of 5 outlaws for almost a week. That's roughly 100 pounds of meat walking around on 4 legs. No wonder they risked the gallows for it. But here's where it gets interesting. Outlaws didn't hunt deer like nobles did. No horses, no horns, no servants flushing game toward waiting archers. They used crossbows. Why? Because crossbows were quieter. A longbow makes this distinctive twang that carries through trees like a dinner bell for foresters. Crossbows just go thunk. Plus, you could hide behind a bush and aim without needing 6 feet of clearance for your bow arms. The really clever ones didn't even bother with bolts. They drove deer toward preset rope snares. Picture a terrified animal running through familiar escape routes, except someone has strung horsehair loops at exactly neck height. Silent, effective, and leaves no arrow evidence behind. Now comes the hard part. You've got a dead deer. Congratulations. You've also got maybe 2 hours before the blood scent attracts every predator and forester within a mile. Butchering happened fast, messy. Outlaws stripped the useful cuts and left everything else. The hide was too bulky. The antlers too recognizable. Just grab the meat, wrap it in leather, and scatter. And I mean scatter. Different men carried portions to different hiding spots. If one guy got caught, the whole band didn't starve. They also targeted does and fawns over big bucks. I know, not exactly heroic, but a fawn weighs maybe 40 pounds. A mature stag, 300. Try dragging that through undergrowth while running from someone who wants to remove your eyes. But deer wasn't always worth the danger. Sometimes you needed protein that didn't come with a death warrant attached. Small game. The unglamorous survival food nobody writes ballads about. Rabbits, hares, squirrels. These little creatures kept more outlaws breathing than any legendary deer ever did. Why? Because killing a rabbit didn't come with a death sentence. Foresters barely cared. The penalty was usually a fine, maybe a beating. Compare that to losing your eyes over venison. So outlaws built deadfall traps, simple contraptions, heavy rock propped up by sticks, bait underneath, rabbit walks in, rock comes down. My grandfather used to say good traps think for you while you sleep. That's exactly what outlaws needed. They checked traps at dawn, critical timing. Foresters started patrols mid-morning, so you grabbed whatever the night delivered and vanished before anyone official showed up. Now here's something worth knowing. A single rabbit gives you roughly 1,000 calories. That's enough to keep one man moving for about half a day. Not exactly a feast, but it's the difference between thinking clearly and making stupid mistakes that get you caught. And the weird part? Hedgehogs were considered premium outlaw cuisine. Seriously, you coat the whole animal in thick clay, toss it into hot coals, wait an hour. The clay hardens, you crack it open, and the spines pull right off with the shell. Inside, tender meat that tastes like extremely gamey chicken. Not exactly restaurant quality, but calories don't judge. Birds work too. Outlaws strung horsehair loops near streams where thrushes and pigeons drank. Patient work. But patience was literally all they had. The beautiful thing about small game, almost no evidence. No massive bloodstains, no heavy carcass, no antlers screaming, "I'm a poacher," to every forester within 3 miles. But protein only solves half the problem. There was another food source hiding in plain sight, one that didn't run away. Now, here's where outlaws got clever, really clever. Fish didn't run away screaming when you approached. They just sat there, swimming, waiting to become dinner. Forest streams and hidden ponds were often less protected than land animals. Foresters obsessed over deer. They counted deer like accountants count coins. But fish? Nobody was taking a census of trout. So outlaws built fish traps, simple contraptions woven from willow branches left overnight in slow-moving water. You'd wake up, check your trap, and breakfast was already caught. My kind of hunting. But the real trick? Tickling. I'm not joking. Trout tickling was an actual technique. You'd reach under a riverbank, find a resting fish, and gently rub its belly. The trout would go completely still, almost hypnotized. Then you grab it and yank it out before it realized what happened. Works better than it sounds. Trust me. Eels were the real prize, though. These slippery creatures could be smoked over low heat and preserved for days without salt. Salt was expensive. Eels were free. You do the math. A skilled outlaw fisherman could catch enough protein in one night to feed his entire band for 3 days. 3 days of food from a few hours of quiet work. No arrows, no noise, no massive carcass to hide. And the cleanup? Almost nothing. Fish bones got buried or scattered in running water. Try tracking a man through a stream. Evidence just floated away downstream. But here's the thing about protein. Meat and fish keep you alive, sure. They give you energy. They fill your stomach. They don't give you vitamins. And without certain nutrients, your body starts falling apart in ways that would genuinely horrify you. Here's the thing about meat. It keeps you breathing. It fills your belly. But it won't stop your teeth from falling out. Scurvy. That's what happens when you don't eat your vegetables. Your gums start bleeding. Old wounds reopen. You get so tired, you can barely stand. Medieval outlaws didn't know about vitamin C, but they absolutely knew that eating only meat turned you into a walking corpse within a few months. So they ate weeds. Lots and lots of weeds. Nettles were the big one. Yes, those stinging plants that ruin summer walks. Outlaws boiled them until the sting disappeared, then slurped them down as a thick, nutritious soup. Tasted like spinach's angry cousin. But it worked. Then there's wild garlic. You could smell an outlaw camp before you saw it, honestly. This stuff grew everywhere in English forests, and it did 2 jobs. Kept you healthy and made rabbit stew actually taste like something worth eating. Dandelions were surprisingly useful too. The leaves packed more vitamin A than carrots. The roots, roasted and crushed into a bitter drink that medieval outlaws probably pretended was coffee. It wasn't, but desperate times, desperate measures. The real skill was timing. Experienced foragers knew exactly which week certain plants appeared. Sorrel in early spring, wood sorrel a bit later, watercress when streams warmed up. Miss the window and you'd have to wait another year. And here's what separated survivors from corpses. Smart outlaws never foraged the same spot twice in a row. Trampled plants and worn paths screamed, "People are here," to any forester paying attention. Greens kept outlaws functional, but they needed serious calories to survive hard months. That meant nuts, and autumn was basically their Black Friday. Acorns, hazelnuts, beech nuts. Autumn was basically Black Friday for medieval outlaws, except instead of trampling each other for discounted televisions, they were scrambling to gather enough calories to survive until spring. And here's the thing most people get wrong about acorns. You can't just eat them raw. Try it, and you'll spend the next 3 days curled up with stomach cramps that make food poisoning look pleasant. Acorns contain tannins, bitter, nasty chemicals that your gut absolutely despises. So outlaws had to boil them, then boil them again, sometimes 5 or 6 times until the water ran clear. Was it tedious? Absolutely. But an experienced forager could gather around 5 pounds of nuts in a single afternoon during peak season. That's serious calories when you're counting every meal. Hazelnuts were the real prize, though. No processing required. Crack them open, eat them, done. Better yet, they could be stored for 6 months if kept dry. Medieval energy bars, basically. Except they actually tasted good. Now here's where it gets competitive. Outlaws weren't the only ones after these nuts. Wild pigs wanted them too, desperately. Smart outlaws actually followed pig trails through the forest because those animals had an almost supernatural ability to find the richest oak groves. Why search yourself when a pig's already done the work? Berries added something outlaws desperately needed. Sugar, blackberries, elderberries, sloes. These provided quick energy that meat and nuts simply couldn't match. Your body craves sweetness for a reason. The pressure was intense. Miss Autumn's 2-month window, and you'd face winter with empty caches. But gathering food was only half the challenge. Cooking it without getting caught? That required an entirely different set of skills. Smoke, that's what got outlaws killed faster than anything else. You could hunt perfectly, trap brilliantly, forage like your life depended on it. Because it did. But light one careless fire and every forester within 3 miles knew exactly where you were hiding. So outlaws became obsessed with invisible cooking. The trick was using bone-dry wood. I'm talking timber that had been dead for at least a year. Freshly cut branches released moisture, and moisture created smoke. Old, seasoned wood burned hot and clean, almost invisible. But here's where it gets clever. Dawn. That narrow window when mist hung heavy over the forest floor. Outlaws cooked during those foggy morning hours, specifically because any smoke that did escape simply blended into the natural haze. By the time foresters started their patrols, the fire was cold and buried. Then there was pit cooking. Dig a hole, line it with stones, build your fire inside until the rocks were screaming hot. Then bury everything. Meat, coals, the whole operation. Cover it with dirt and walk away. 6 hours later, perfectly roasted venison with 0 visible flames, 0 smoke plumes, 0 evidence. And the weird part is, many outlaws just skipped cooking entirely. They ate meat half raw, barely warmed, or they dried it into jerky using nothing but air and time. Not exactly a 5-star dining experience, but dead men don't complain about texture. My personal favorite method? Hot stone boiling. Drop fire-heated rocks into a leather pouch filled with water. The stones transfer heat without any actual flames. Stew without a fire. Genius. Smart bands never use the same cooking site twice in a month, but even perfect cooking skills couldn't solve the biggest problem outlaws faced: other humans. Sometimes the forest just didn't cooperate. Traps came up empty. Deer vanished into the deeper woods. Streams froze. And suddenly, that carefully planned foraging lifestyle fell apart completely. That's when outlaws turned to their backup plan: stealing from people. Medieval outlaws regularly raided peasant farms under cover of darkness. Chickens were the easiest targets. Grab 2 hens, wring their necks quietly, and disappear before the dogs started barking. Eggs, bread, stored grain, whatever wasn't nailed down became fair game. But here's where it gets interesting. Travelers were actually safer to rob than you'd think. Not merchant caravans with armed guards. I'm talking about ordinary people walking between villages. A lone farmer heading to market might carry cheese, dried meat, maybe a skin of ale. Minimal resistance, maximum reward. And the weird part? Some outlaws became local celebrities. Villages near outlaw territory developed this strange relationship with the criminals hiding in their forests. Peasants would leave food at the forest edge, call it a protection offering, call it medieval insurance. Either way, it worked. The outlaws got fed, the village didn't get raided. Church donations were another popular target. Monasteries often received food gifts left outside their gates: bread, preserved fruits, sometimes even meat. Outlaws watched these drop-off points like hawks watching a mouse hole. A single farmstead raid could yield enough grain to make rough bread for a week, not fancy bread. We're talking flour mixed with water and cooked on hot stones. But calories were calories. The line between outlaw and folk hero, it came down to who you robbed. Steal from peasants, you're scum. Steal only from wealthy travelers, now you're practically a legend. But all that food meant nothing without clean water. Water was the silent killer nobody talks about. Forget swords, forget hangings. Dirty water murdered more medieval people than any human enemy ever did. Dysentery, cholera, parasites. One bad drink from a stagnant pond and you'd be dead within a week, bleeding from places you really don't want to bleed from. Outlaws understood this problem intimately. They memorized every spring within miles of their territory, every fast-moving stream, every reliable water source that didn't smell like death. These locations became as valuable as any food cache. But here's the catch. Boiling water required fire. Fire meant smoke. Smoke meant foresters. So most outlaws just gambled. They drank straight from streams and hoped for the best. Sometimes that worked, sometimes it really didn't. This is actually why stolen ale was so valuable. Medieval ale wasn't about getting drunk. The brewing process killed most dangerous bacteria. A skin of weak beer stolen from a traveler was genuinely safer than the cleanest-looking stream. Your body might hate the taste. Your intestines would thank you later. And then there was morning dew. Outlaws learned to wake before dawn and drag cloth across wet grass. Wring it into a container. Repeat until you had enough to drink. Tedious? Absolutely. But that dew was guaranteed clean. No parasites, no mystery bacteria, just pure condensation. Camp placement revolved entirely around water access. A defensible hilltop meant nothing if the nearest spring was 2 miles away. Outlaws chose vulnerable positions near streams over fortified positions far from hydration. Being captured beat dying of thirst. Usually, water kept you alive. But surviving winter, that required something else entirely. Because when December arrived, even the forest's most experienced outlaws started dying. Winter wasn't just hard, it was a massacre in slow motion. That abundant forest, the one overflowing with rabbits and berries and opportunity, gone. Completely transformed into a frozen wasteland where finding food became nearly impossible. Deer moved to lower elevations. Rabbits stayed underground. Fish? Good luck breaking through ice without making enough noise to alert every forester within miles. The generous woodland suddenly had nothing to offer except cold and silence. Here's where autumn planning separated survivors from corpses. Smart outlaws spent September and October burying food caches throughout their territory. Nuts wrapped in leather, dried meat hidden under rock piles, emergency supplies scattered across dozens of secret locations, like medieval preppers with really bad real estate. But even the best planners ran out by January. That's when things got genuinely desperate. Outlaws started digging up hibernating animals, badgers sleeping in their dens, hedgehogs curled in leaf piles. Anything with meat on its bones became fair game. You'd eat a dormant hedgehog without hesitation when your ribs were showing. Some outlaws chose a different survival strategy. They surrendered, intentionally. Walk into a village, confess to some minor crime, and spend winter in a dungeon eating prison bread. Terrible? Absolutely. Better than freezing to death under a snow-covered log. Several historical records show outlaw bands shrinking dramatically each winter, then rebuilding come spring. The math is grim but obvious. And then there's bark, tree bark, specifically the inner layer of elm and pine. Outlaws would strip it, boil it, and choke it down. Almost zero nutrition, but it filled your stomach enough to stop the cramps. Survival cuisine at its absolute worst. Those who made it to March earned their legend.